Naomi should have looked away. In houses like this, the safest skill was knowing what was not yours to notice. But the girl beneath the piano was folded into herself so tightly that even from across the room Naomi could see the strain in her small shoulders, the way her fingers pressed hard over her ears as if sound itself had turned sharp. The child was dressed for the evening in a pale blue party dress with a satin sash that had come loose at the back, one white shoe tilted sideways on the rug, her breathing too fast for a room this polished, too fast for a child surrounded by silver trays and candlelight, and people pretending everything was beautiful. Naomi lifted the soaked towel from the floor and rose carefully, her knees stiff from the marble. The last trace of wine was gone, but the hush remained. Victoria gave a satisfied nod, as though the room had just been restored to its proper order. "Take that to the service hall, and come back immediately," she said. "And straighten your apron before you do." Naomi lowered her eyes just enough to pass for obedience, then turned toward the side corridor with the towel draped over her hand. Halfway there, she heard it again, not a cry exactly, but a thin, trapped sound beneath the music. The kind a child made when holding herself together had become work. Most of the guests missed it, or chose to. Naomi did not. She slipped through the curtain near the bar, left the stained towel on a prep counter, and reached for the extra pair of noise-reducing headphones she had noticed earlier in a wicker basket beside the coat check. One of the event planners had brought coloring books, fidget toys, and spare comfort items for children, though most of them sat untouched, arranged more for appearance than use. Naomi took the headphones and crossed back into the ballroom with quiet steps, keeping close to the wall. No one stopped her. No one expected the housekeeper carrying a folded linen napkin to be carrying anything important. When she reached the piano, she crouched just enough to bring herself into the child's line of sight. "Hey, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice low enough that it barely disturbed the air. "You do not have to talk to me. I am just going to leave these here, all right?" The girl looked up through shining eyes, startled but not afraid. Up close, Naomi could see freckles across her nose and a tiny gold bracelet sliding down her wrist. She placed the headphones gently on the rug within reach and added the clean linen napkin beside them, folded around 2 peppermint candies from the coffee station. The girl blinked once, then twice, and her hands loosened from her ears by a fraction. Naomi gave her a small nod, the kind that asked for nothing back. "Too much noise can feel big," she whispered. "This might help make the room smaller." The child stared at her for a moment longer, then reached out and pulled the headphones into her lap. Naomi stood before anyone could turn the moment into spectacle. As she stepped back, she caught sight of Victoria across the room, watching from beside a column with that same careful smile. Only now it was thinner, colder. And when Naomi returned to the service hallway, she had the unmistakable feeling that the evening had not finished humiliating her yet. It had only changed shape. The service hallway felt like a different country from the ballroom. The music turned muffled behind the swinging doors, reduced to a faint pulse under the hum of refrigeration and the rattle of rolling carts. Stainless steel counters caught the harsh white light overhead. Someone in the kitchen was calling for fresh trays of crab cakes. Someone else was arguing softly about champagne flutes. Naomi stood at the prep sink with her hands under cool water, watching diluted red wine spiral down the drain, and for a moment, she let her shoulders drop. Only for a moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her apron and touched the edge of the blue handkerchief folded there, the one her mother had hemmed by hand years ago at a second-hand sewing machine that always skipped on tight corners. The cotton was soft now from use, almost thin at the edges, but Naomi still carried it on every shift like a small piece of home. 3 weeks. That was all she had been in this house. 21 days of polished silver, folded napkins, quiet footsteps, and instructions delivered in tones that sounded polite until you listened closely. 3 weeks since she had taken the bus across town before sunrise, stood in a neat line outside the staff entrance, and promised herself she would keep this job no matter how cold the rooms felt or how often people looked through her instead of at her. Her mother's prescriptions were due again next Thursday. Her younger brother Caleb needed money for a geometry workbook and the bus pass. He kept insisting he could stretch another month. The landlord had taped a reminder to their apartment door that morning in cheerful blue ink, as if rent were a friendly suggestion instead of a deadline. Naomi dried her hands and refolded the stained towel into a clean square, more out of habit than need. She had learned that too from her mother. When life frayed, fold what you can. Straighten what is in reach. Do not give hard days the satisfaction of seeing you come apart. There you are. Naomi turned. Carmen, one of the evening servers, stood in the doorway balancing a tray of empty glasses against her hip. She was in her late 40s, quick with a joke when no supervisors were around, and one of the few people in the house who made eye contact like it meant something. Her brows pulled together when she saw Naomi's expression. You all right? Naomi nodded automatically. I am working. Carmen gave her a look that said she was too old to be fooled by that answer. That woman is showing off tonight, she muttered, lowering her voice. You did not deserve that out there. Naomi glanced toward the ballroom doors. It is fine. No, Carmen said, not harshly, just plainly. It is not. But I know what fine means when somebody needs the check. Naomi let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though it carried no real humor. Carmen shifted the tray higher and leaned closer. Word is the owner might come back earlier than expected. Flight got moved up. Naomi blinked. She had only seen Richard Ellison once from a distance on her second morning, a tall silver-haired man crossing the foyer with a phone to his ear and the distracted posture of someone used to being listened to. Tonight? She asked. Carmen shrugged. Maybe. Maybe not. Around here, people change plans the way other folks change shirts. Before Naomi could answer, the service door swung open again with a sharp, deliberate push. Victoria Hayes stepped inside, her cream blazer untouched, her lipstick exact, her eyes landing on Naomi with the calm precision of someone who had already decided what came next. There you are, she said, and this time the words did not sound relieved. They sounded arranged. Victoria Hayes had a way of filling a doorway without raising her voice. She stood there now with one hand resting lightly against the stainless steel frame, as if she owned not just the hallway but the silence inside it. Her cream blazer had not shifted by so much as an inch all evening. Not a wrinkle, not a smudge. Even under the unforgiving kitchen lights, she looked assembled, polished into authority. Naomi had seen that look before on women who never touched the mess, but always took credit for cleaning it. Victoria let her gaze pass over Carmen first, cool and dismissive, then settle on Naomi with deliberate patience. The Carson party in the East Salon needs fresh champagne, she said. And the Marlowe table wants their dessert service reset because someone managed to slow the whole room down. Her tone stayed smooth, but the word someone landed exactly where she intended. Carmen shifted her tray and looked away, wise enough not to intervene. Naomi folded her hands at her waist. Yes, ma'am. Victoria stepped closer, heels tapping once against the tile. And before you go back out there, let me make something very clear. The kitchen noise seemed to recede by a degree. Even the dishwasher at the far station paused, listening with its mechanical breath. This house runs on order, Victoria said. Guests come here expecting perfection. They do not come here to watch staff improvise, insert themselves into private moments, or mistake kindness for permission. Naomi knew exactly what she meant. The little girl under the piano, the headphones, the one small human act that had apparently crossed some invisible line. Naomi kept her face composed. I only wanted to help. Victoria smiled then, but it was the kind of smile that made rooms colder. That is where girls like you often get confused. You think helping means being seen. It does not. In this house, good staff are remembered for one thing only. They do not become a problem. The sentence settled over the prep counter like dust. Carmen inhaled quietly through her nose. Naomi felt the blue handkerchief in her apron pocket as if it had warmed against her hip. She thought of her mother saying dignity was not something people handed you. It was something you kept even when they tried to make you set it down. Victoria turned and began walking toward the ballroom doors, not looking back because she expected to be followed. Naomi did follow because rent was due, because medicine did not care about pride, because Caleb needed that workbook and the bus pass and 100 other ordinary things that cost money. As they moved through the service corridor, Victoria spoke over her shoulder in the calm, clipped rhythm of someone reciting policy she had personally invented. Mr. Ellison trusted me to keep standards here long before you arrived. When he is away, I make decisions. I protect this house. I protect its reputation. And I do not tolerate disorder from staff who forget their place. There it was at last, the true center of her cruelty. Not anger, not even dislike. Performance. Victoria did not just control the estate. She curated it. Every polished glass, every lowered voice, every nervous server stepping 2 inches to the left when she passed was part of the world she built around herself. Naomi saw it clearly now as they neared the ballroom, and the sound of strings drifted back through the doors. Victoria liked correction best when there was an audience. She liked people most when they were useful and smallest when they were afraid. Just before she pushed the door open, she glanced at Naomi one more time, her expression almost pleasant. "Try very hard not to embarrass yourself again," she said. Then the golden light spilled over them both, and the night, which had already been cruel, seemed to draw in a deeper breath. Naomi stepped back into the ballroom carrying a fresh silver tray of champagne flutes, the stems cold against her fingers, the bubbles rising in neat, restless strings. The room had recovered its rhythm on the surface. Conversations had restarted. Laughter had returned in polished little bursts. A waiter slipped past her with miniature crab cakes balanced like coins on a black lacquer platter. From the quartet in the corner came the soft pull of a cello, low and elegant, the kind of sound meant to make expensive people feel even more expensive. But Naomi could still feel the shape of Victoria's warning hanging over the room, like perfume too strong to ignore. She moved along the edge of the crowd with the quiet precision the job demanded, offering glasses, collecting used plates, keeping her eyes lowered just enough to seem invisible. When she passed the grand piano, she let herself glance down for only half a second. The little girl was no longer hiding all the way underneath. She sat with her back against the curved black leg of the instrument, the blue headphones now over her ears, one hand resting on the folded linen napkin Naomi had left. Her breathing had slowed. A peppermint wrapper glittered beside her shoe like a tiny silver leaf. The child looked up and their eyes met for a brief, clean moment. No smile, no words, just recognition. Then the girl gave the smallest nod, as if she understood that gratitude sometimes had to stay quiet in rooms like this. Naomi kept walking. Near the East Salon, a group of guests had gathered around a display of old family photographs arranged on velvet easels beside the fireplace. She recognized none of the faces, but the captions were discreet and expensive-looking, little engraved plates naming summer houses in Martha's Vineyard and foundation galas in Manhattan. At the center of the display, under a glass dome, lay a gold and emerald brooch shaped like a climbing vine, its stones deep green under the candlelight. It was beautiful in the way old wealth always was, less flashy than precise, every detail designed to suggest permanence. Naomi had dusted around that display earlier in the afternoon, while an event planner reminded the staff twice not to touch anything inside the East Salon without permission. "The Marlowe brooch," one guest was saying now, leaning toward the glass. "19th century, if I remember correctly." Another woman smiled into her champagne. "Only Evelyn would wear family history to a dinner party and call it modest." The women laughed softly, their bracelets whispering against crystal stems. Naomi turned away and continued toward the dessert station where the miniature lemon tarts needed replacing. She kept her steps measured, her face composed, but she noticed more tonight than Victoria would have liked. She noticed that several guests had drifted closer to the salon than before. She noticed that Victoria herself remained near the fireplace more than necessary, speaking to a silver-haired woman in a satin gown with the posture of someone managing both hospitality and surveillance. Most of all, Naomi noticed that the little girl with the headphones had now left the piano and moved to a chair near the French doors, still wearing the blue set, swinging one white shoe slowly above the rug, calmer now, watching the room with solemn dark eyes that missed very little. Naomi had just set down the last tray of lemon tarts when the silver-haired woman by the fireplace touched her throat, froze, and then touched it again with sudden force, as if disbelief might change what her fingers found. Her face lost color even under the candle glow. "My brooch," she said, too softly at first for the room to react. Then louder, sharp enough to cut through the music, "My brooch is gone. No one leaves this room until we find it." Victoria's voice rang out before the last note from the quartet had fully died, smooth and commanding, the kind of voice that did not need to shout because it had spent years training people to obey. The ballroom changed all at once. Laughter collapsed. Glasses lowered. A server near the east wall froze with a tray of petit fours balanced in both hands. Mrs. Evelyn Marlowe stood beside the fireplace with one trembling hand at the neckline of her silver gown, her face pale beneath careful makeup, her eyes moving from the glass display to the guests around her, as if disbelief might still turn into relief. "It was here," she said more tightly now. "I had it on 10 minutes ago. I took it off because the clasp kept catching. I set it by the photographs." A ripple moved through the room, not loud, but fast. People shifted into silence the way wealthy people often did, with control first and discomfort second. Naomi stood beside the dessert station with an empty silver tray against her hip, her pulse suddenly loud in her ears. She did not move. She did not need to. Victoria was already crossing the room, her cream blazer flashing between candlelight and shadow, all polished authority and manufactured calm. "I am sure this is a misunderstanding," she said as she arrived beside Mrs. Marlowe. "Please, everyone, remain where you are for just a moment. We will handle this discreetly." Discreetly. The words sounded elegant, but the room had already gone sharp. Naomi saw it in the angles of shoulders, in the way two women near the bar exchanged a glance, and then looked quickly toward the staff, in the little pause before judgment starts choosing where to land. Victoria bent toward the velvet easel table, examined the glass dome, the photographs, the folds of the runner cloth, then straightened with a measured inhale. "Who was assigned to this section?" she asked, though Naomi could hear from her tone that the question was not really a question at all. An event planner opened her mouth, hesitated, and looked toward the staff line along the wall. Naomi felt several faces turn before anyone said her name. Naomi was rotating East Salon and dessert service. One of the junior servers answered, too softly. Victoria turned slowly then, like a woman unveiling something she had known would be there all along. "Of course," she said. Not loud, not emotional. Somehow that made it worse. Naomi set the empty tray down on the nearest side table with deliberate care. "Ma'am," she said, keeping her voice level, "I did not touch Mrs. Marlowe's brooch." Victoria gave a small, almost sympathetic tilt of the head that made Naomi's stomach tighten. It was the posture of someone pretending fairness while arranging a fall. "No one has accused you of anything yet," she replied, and every guest in the room heard the lie inside the sentence. Mrs. Marlowe looked from Victoria to Naomi, uncertain, upset, clutching one gloved hand in the other. "I only want it found," she murmured. "It was my grandmother's." Naomi nodded once. "And I want that too." The little girl by the French doors had stopped swinging her shoe. Through the blue headphones, her solemn eyes were fixed on Naomi now, unblinking. Victoria stepped closer, the click of her heels precise on the marble. "Then you will not mind," she said, her smile thin as glass. "If we take a careful look through your cart before this becomes even more embarrassing for everyone." For a second, Naomi thought the room might still have enough decency left to hesitate. It did not. A narrow path opened through the guests as Victoria lifted one hand and motioned toward the housekeeping cart parked just beyond the East Salon doors, tucked near the service corridor where Naomi had left it less than 15 minutes earlier. The cart looked exactly as it always did, gray plastic shelves stacked with folded towels, glass cleaner, polish, spare napkins, a dusting cloth, and the small order of a night built on other people never noticing the work it took to keep beauty clean. Now every eye in the ballroom followed it, as if it had become a witness stand. "Bring it here," Victoria said. No one moved at first. Then one of the young footmen, pale and visibly uncomfortable, wheeled it forward across the marble. The sound of its rubber casters seemed too loud for the silence around it. Naomi stood where she was, shoulders level, hands open at her sides. She could feel the weight of judgment assembling itself in the room, not because anyone had proof, but because suspicion always liked an easy shape. Victoria stopped beside the cart and rested her fingertips on the top shelf as if the whole thing offended her. "Mrs. Marlowe," she said gently, turning just enough to include the older woman in the performance, "we will clear this up right now." Naomi's gaze flicked to the little girl by the French doors. She was still in the chair, blue headphones on, her face small and intent, both hands now gripping the edge of the seat. Naomi looked back at Victoria. "Ma'am," she said, calm enough that several guests shifted, surprised by it. That cart was unattended in the service hall. Victoria did not even glance at her. "Then you should have been more careful with it." The sentence landed with the softness of velvet and the cruelty of a lock turning. She began lifting items one by one. Towels, spray bottle, box of gloves, napkins, a tray liner. Everything ordinary looked suddenly incriminating under rich people's eyes. One guest near the fireplace whispered something to her husband. Another stared at Naomi with the brittle sympathy people offered when they had already decided not to intervene. Naomi could hear her own pulse now, steady but hard, and beneath it the memory of her mother's voice from years ago in a cramped kitchen that smelled like starch and tea. Let people reveal themselves. Truth does not rush, but it arrives. Victoria reached the middle shelf and paused. Her manicured hand disappeared behind a stack of folded polishing cloths. When it came back out, the room inhaled. Resting against her palm, green stones flashing beneath the chandelier light, was the gold and emerald brooch. Mrs. Marlowe let out a broken little sound and pressed one hand to her chest. Someone near the bar said, "Oh my God," under his breath. The footman with the cart went white. Victoria held the brooch up between two fingers, not triumphant exactly, but worse, vindicated. "Well," she said, with a sadness so rehearsed it might have fooled anyone who did not already know her. "That is deeply disappointing." Naomi did not step back, did not protest wildly, did not give the room the spectacle it expected. She only looked at the brooch, then at Victoria's face, and understood with sudden cold clarity that this had been waiting for her before Mrs. Marlowe ever realized it was gone. When Naomi spoke, her voice was quiet, but in the silence it carried to every corner of the ballroom. "That was not in my cart 5 minutes ago." The sentence did not rise. It did not shake. It simply hung there in the ballroom, clean and level, and somehow that made the silence heavier. Naomi stood beside the cart with her hands still open at her sides, her dark uniform neat despite the long shift, her breathing measured, her eyes resting not on the guests or the brooch or even Mrs. Marlowe's stricken face, but on Victoria Hayes. The emerald stones caught the chandelier light in sharp green flashes between Victoria's fingers. Around them, crystal and candlelight and polished wood held perfectly still, as if the room itself had leaned in to see which version of the truth money would choose. Victoria let the brooch rest in her palm for one beat longer, then exhaled through a small practiced smile. "Naomi," she said, with the calm disappointment of a school principal addressing a child who had become inconvenient in public, "this is not the time to make things worse for yourself." A murmur stirred near the fireplace and died just as quickly. Naomi could feel it all without turning her head. Mrs. Marlowe's grief, the guest's curiosity dressed up as concern, the staff's fear, thinner and sharper because it lived closer to consequence. Somewhere near the bar, a glass touched a tray with a faint bright click. Naomi's pulse stayed steady. She had learned long ago that panic only helped the person already trying to bury you. "I am not making anything worse," she said softly. "I am telling you the truth." Victoria gave the kind of sympathetic nod that only cruel people ever perfected. "The brooch was found in your cart. My cart was left alone in the service hallway." "Then that was careless." Naomi looked at her for a moment. Just looked. It was not a glare, and it was not surrender. It was the stillness of someone refusing to step into the shape another person had prepared for her. The room noticed. She could tell because the silence changed. It was no longer the easy silence of a crowd ready to believe the worst about the least powerful person present. It had become something more unsettled, more alert. One of the older men near the photograph display cleared his throat and shifted his weight. A woman in black gloves glanced from Naomi to Victoria and narrowed her eyes the smallest amount, as though a detail in the scene had stopped fitting as neatly as it first had. Victoria seemed to feel it too. Her shoulders drew back by half an inch. "I think," she said, now a little brighter, a little colder, "that we should spare Mrs. Marlowe any further discomfort and ask security to escort you out while we sort through the rest of this." Naomi did not move. The blue handkerchief in her apron pocket pressed warm against her hip like a reminder. "Fold what you can. Straighten what is in reach. Do not give hard days the satisfaction." She turned her head then, finally, and looked toward the service corridor just beyond the east salon doors. In her mind, she saw the narrow hallway, the white crown molding, the mirrored console table, the camera dome fixed high above the west archway where staff entered and exited all evening long. She had noticed it on her first day because survival had taught her to map rooms the way other people mapped excuses. When she looked back at Victoria, her voice stayed even. Then let us check the camera near the west hallway before anyone decides what this means. For the first time all night, Victoria did not answer immediately. That pause was small, barely a second. But in a room like this, where power usually answered before anyone else finished speaking, even a second could sound loud. Victoria's smile returned a moment later, polished and thin. The cameras in the west hallway are for general security, she said. They do not always capture every angle. Naomi did not blink. Then we can still look. Mrs. Marlowe stood very still near the fireplace, one gloved hand pressed against the hollow of her throat, her face drawn with the kind of hurt that came from losing more than jewelry. Around her, the guests had begun to shift in a new way. Not away from Naomi this time, but between Naomi and Victoria, as though the line of certainty in the room had loosened. A man in a charcoal tuxedo glanced toward the service arch. There is no harm in checking, he said carefully, lifting one shoulder. If it clears things up. Another guest, the woman in black gloves, turned to Victoria with brows slightly raised. Surely that would be the quickest way to settle this. Victoria held the brooch a little tighter. Naomi noticed because the emerald stones tilted in her palm. I am trying to protect Mrs. Marlowe from a prolonged scene, she said. And I am trying to protect the truth, Naomi replied, still calm, still standing straight beside the cart that had nearly become her grave in this house. The words landed harder than volume ever could. A hush opened again, but it was different now, less obedient. Near the French doors, the little girl in the blue headphones slid down from her chair. Her white shoe touched the rug first, then the other. She stood there for a second with both hands at her sides, looking very small beneath the chandeliers, then started walking across the room. No one stopped her. Children in wealthy rooms were often treated like polished accessories until they moved with purpose. Then suddenly everyone noticed. Naomi saw her first, then Mrs. Marlowe. Then the guests nearest the windows turned as the girl came forward, blue headphones still around her ears, pale dress swaying at her knees. She did not go to Victoria. She went straight to Naomi and stopped beside her, close enough that the edge of her sleeve brushed Naomi's hand. The child looked up, solemn and pale, then turned toward the room. She helped me, she said. Her voice was soft, but the ballroom was so silent that every syllable carried. Victoria's jaw tightened for the briefest instant. Olivia, she said, with a brightness that sounded false the moment it left her mouth. Sweetheart, this is not the time. Olivia did not look at her. She gave me the headphones, the girl continued, touching one ear cup with her fingertips. When it got too loud, she did not even tell anyone. She just helped me. Mrs. Marlowe lowered her hand from her throat. Several guests exchanged glances. Naomi said nothing. She only stood there, feeling the small, steady nearness of the child beside her like a hand on the scale of the room. Then, from beyond the side entrance near the garden hall, a deeper voice cut across the silence. What exactly is going on here? Heads turned all at once. A tall silver-haired man had just stepped through the open doorway, travel coat still on, one hand holding a leather weekender at his side. Richard Ellison had arrived. The room changed the moment Richard Ellison stepped fully into it. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the subtle, immediate recalibration that happened whenever real authority arrived, and everyone who had been borrowing power had to remember the difference. He was taller than Naomi had realized from a distance, broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, his dark travel coat still carrying the chill from outside. A few guests straightened instinctively. One of the servers near the bar nearly lowered his head. Even Mrs. Marlowe's expression shifted from distress to something closer to relief. Richard set his leather weekender down by the console table without taking his eyes off the scene in front of him. The stopped music, the cluster of guests near the East Salon, Victoria Hayes standing with the emerald brooch in her hand, Naomi beside the housekeeping cart, and Olivia in blue headphones at Naomi's side like a quiet fact no one had planned for. Richard, Mrs. Marlowe said first, her voice tight. My brooch was missing, and now it has been found, but there seems to be some question about how. Richard's gaze moved once to the brooch, then to Naomi, then back to Victoria. He did not look confused. He looked tired, sharp, and instantly attentive in the way men became when they were used to hearing incomplete stories and finding the missing piece themselves. "Then I would like the full version," he said. Victoria recovered first, of course. She always did. She drew in a controlled breath and stepped forward with the brooch resting neatly in her palm. "Mrs. Marlowe's heirloom was discovered in Naomi Carter's cart," she said. "I was trying to resolve the matter discreetly and spare everyone unnecessary discomfort." Richard's face did not move. "And the question?" It was Naomi who answered. "My cart was unattended in the west hallway," she said. "I asked that the camera there be checked before anyone decides what happened." The words landed plainly, without embellishment, and Richard's eyes shifted to her again, studying her in a way that made Naomi feel seen for the first time all night rather than examined. Victoria gave a soft, almost regretful laugh. "As I explained, that camera does not always show enough to be useful." Olivia looked up then, small chin lifting. "She helped me," the girl said again, this time to Richard. "She did not steal anything." Something in Richard's face gentled for half a second when he looked at her, but when he turned back to Victoria, the softness was gone. "If there is a camera," he said, "then we look." No one argued. 2 minutes later the ballroom had shifted toward the adjoining study, where a wall-mounted monitor sat above a walnut credenza used for household security and event feeds. Guests clustered near the doorway, careful but curious. Staff remained farther back, silent as shadows. Naomi stood near the end of the room with Olivia still beside her, the child's small fingers now curled around the folded linen napkin. Richard stood closest to the screen. Victoria remained to his right, her posture immaculate, though Naomi noticed for the first time a tiny shine of tension at her temple. The head of security pulled up the west hallway feed and rolled the footage back. Grainy black and white replaced candlelight and gold. Timestamps flickered in the corner. There was Naomi earlier, passing through with a tray. There was the empty hallway after. Then the cart, left alone beside the archway exactly where Naomi remembered. For a few seconds, no one entered the frame. Then Victoria appeared. She looked once over her shoulder, stepped to the cart, and with swift practiced hands slipped something small and bright beneath a stack of polishing cloths before walking calmly out of view. The study went dead silent. On the screen, the emerald stones flashed even in black and white. No one moved. Even the security monitor seemed too bright for the silence it had created. The grainy hallway image remained frozen on the screen. Victoria Hayes half turned toward Naomi's cart, one hand still buried beneath the stack of polishing cloths, the small bright shape of the brooch caught in the black and white glare like guilt refusing to hide. In the study, the air felt suddenly thinner, stripped of music and candlelight, and every polished lie the evening had been wearing. Mrs. Marlowe lifted one hand to her mouth. The woman in black gloves stared at the screen as if she had been personally insulted by the truth. One of the younger guests let out a breath he had clearly been holding for several seconds. Naomi stood very still near the back of the room, Olivia beside her, and felt the strange, almost dizzying shift that came when a lie finally collapsed under its own weight. She did not feel triumph. Not yet. Only clarity. Richard Ellison was the first to speak. "Run it again." His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room more cleanly than shouting ever could. The head of security obeyed. The footage rolled back. Victoria entered the frame again. She looked over her shoulder again. She reached into the cart again. She planted the brooch again. There was no missing angle now. No ambiguity. No elegant version of events left to rescue. When the video stopped the second time, Victoria tried to straighten herself into composure, but the effort showed. The perfect calm she wore like a second skin had started to crack around the edges. "Richard," she said, and for the first time all night her voice sounded like it belonged to a person rather than a position. "This is not what it looks like." Richard turned his head slowly. "Then tell me what it is." Victoria swallowed. "I was trying to prevent a larger embarrassment." Mrs. Marlowe was already upset. "The staff has been careless all evening. I thought if I recovered the piece quickly and dealt with the matter privately, I could avoid a scandal." Naomi felt several people in the room recoil from that sentence without moving an inch. Even now Victoria was trying to rearrange the truth into something useful. Richard's expression did not change, but something in his eyes hardened. "You humiliated an innocent employee in front of my guests," he said, "and you call that preventing embarrassment." Olivia stepped closer to Naomi then, her shoulder lightly touching Naomi's arm. Richard noticed. His gaze dropped to the blue headphones still resting over his granddaughter's ears, then to the folded linen napkin in her hand, and something flickered across his face. Not confusion. Recognition. He looked at Olivia. "Were you wearing those when I came in?" She nodded. "She gave them to me." Richard's eyes returned to Naomi, more focused now, reaching backward through memory. "You were in the music room last Thursday afternoon," he said. It was not exactly a question. Naomi blinked once, surprised. "Yes, sir." The study stayed silent. Richard took one slow breath. Olivia had a difficult moment after the florist changed the layout. Everyone else kept calling for space, for staff, for solutions. You sat on the floor 6 feet away and spoke to her like she was a person, not a problem. Naomi had not known he had seen that. She remembered the sunlight in that room, the smell of lilies, the child pressed behind a velvet chair with her hands over her ears, and her own voice kept low and patient because some children needed the world to stop performing before they could breathe inside it. "I was only trying to help," she said. Richard looked at her for a long moment, then at Victoria. When he spoke again, the room seemed to draw itself straighter around the words. "And that," he said, "is exactly what you punished her for." The words settled over the study with the clean weight of a door closing. No one rushed to fill the silence after Richard spoke. Victoria Hayes stood near the security monitor with her hands clasped too tightly at her waist, her cream blazer still immaculate, her face still arranged, but the arrangement no longer held. It had become visible now, the strain beneath the polish, the frantic calculation behind the controlled breathing. Around her, guests who had spent the evening smiling over champagne and old money no longer looked entertained. They looked embarrassed to have been standing so close to cruelty and not naming it sooner. Mrs. Marlowe stepped forward first. She was still shaken, but her voice had steadied. "Naomi," she said, turning with real effort toward the woman she had nearly been persuaded to distrust. "I owe you an apology." Naomi met her eyes. Candlelight from the ballroom reached into the study. In a pale gold spill, catching the tiredness at the corners of Mrs. Marlowe's face and the shine still clinging to the emerald brooch in her hand. "You do not owe me for what someone else chose," Naomi said softly. "I am just glad your family peace was found." That answer moved through the room differently than outrage would have. It did not flare. It landed. A few guests lowered their eyes. One of the servers near the doorway looked at Naomi with something close to disbelief, as if he had expected anger and did not know what to do with grace instead. Richard noticed that too. Naomi could feel it. His attention remained on her for a beat longer, not in pity, not in surprise, but in the quiet recognition reserved for people who reveal themselves under pressure. Victoria drew a careful breath. "Richard, I made a terrible error in judgment," she said. "But I have given years to this house. I have protected its standards, its reputation, your events, your guests. Do not let one moment erase all of that." Richard turned to her fully then. "One moment does not erase a record," he said. "It reveals it." The sentence entered the silence like a pin through silk. Victoria opened her mouth, then stopped. For the first time all night, she seemed to understand that authority was no longer something she could perform back into existence. Olivia reached up and slipped one side of the blue headphones off her ear. She looked at Naomi, then at her grandfather. "She did not make a scene," the child said quietly. "Everybody else did." Richard's expression changed by a fraction, enough to show he knew the child was right. Naomi glanced down at Olivia, and the corner of her mouth softened, just once. Then she looked back at Richard. "Sir," she said, and now every face in the study was turned toward her. "I do not need anyone humiliated for me to feel cleared. I just needed the truth to stay standing." No one spoke after that. Not for a full breath. Not for two. Because the sentence had exposed more than Victoria's lie. It had exposed the room itself, the guests, the staff, the careful social order that had nearly chosen comfort over truth because truth had arrived wearing a dark housekeeping uniform and a name tag. Richard held Naomi's gaze and gave the smallest nod, the kind men like him probably imagined meant less than it did. But Naomi felt the difference in it immediately. It was not gratitude alone. It was respect. And in that house, on that night, respect sounded louder than any apology ever could. Richard did not raise his voice when he ended it. He simply looked at Victoria Hayes with the stillness of a man who no longer needed more evidence, more explanation, or more performance. "Turn in your keys before you leave the property," he said. "You are done here tonight." The sentence was quiet, almost plain, but it broke whatever was left of her authority more completely than anger would have. Victoria stood motionless for a second, as if the room itself had failed to follow the script she had written for it. Then color rose along her neck, faint but visible beneath the careful makeup. She glanced at the guests, at Mrs. Marlowe, at the security monitor that had stripped her story down to its bones, and found nothing waiting for her there. No rescue, no polite excuse, no borrowed power left to stand on. She reached slowly into the pocket of her blazer, removed a ring of brass keys, and placed them on the walnut credenza beside the monitor. The small metallic sound they made was almost delicate. Then she turned and walked out of the study without another word, her heels sharp against the hardwood at first, then softer as the distance took her. No one followed. The silence after she left was not empty. It was clean. Richard let it settle for a moment before turning back to the room. "Mrs. Marlowe," he said, "I am sorry this happened in my home." She nodded, still holding the recovered brooch in both hands now, as if its weight had changed. "And I am sorry," she said, looking at Naomi once more, this time without hesitation, "that I let fear look in the wrong direction." Naomi inclined her head gently. "I understand." Richard then faced the staff gathered at the doorway, the servers, the footmen, the event assistants, all of them standing straighter now, as though the truth had reached them too. "The evening is over," he said. "Please see our guests out with care." The spell of the night began to loosen. People moved again, though more quietly than before. A few guests offered Naomi brief, awkward nods as they passed, the kind people gave when they knew apology belonged in the space between them, but did not trust themselves to speak it well. Olivia did not move with the others. She stepped closer instead and held up the folded linen napkin. "You forgot this," she said. Naomi smiled, small and real, and took it back. "Thank you, sweetheart." The child hesitated, then leaned lightly against Naomi's side for one brief second before her grandfather reached for her hand. Richard watched that too. When the room had thinned and the last of the guests were drifting toward the foyer beneath the warm chandelier glow, Naomi bent to lift the housekeeping card handle, ready to wheel it back into the service hall and finish whatever work remained. Richard stopped her with a gentle gesture. "One moment." He stepped closer and looked down at her uniform where the edge of her name tag had come loose, one corner bent from the strain of the night. Without ceremony, he straightened it himself and fastened it properly against the dark fabric. His hands were careful, respectful, the gesture simple enough that anyone else might have missed its meaning. But Naomi felt it. So did he. "Character reveals itself fastest," Richard said quietly, meeting her eyes at last, "when power thinks no one important is watching." Naomi's fingers closed around the blue handkerchief in her apron pocket, soft with years, warm from her hand. Beyond them, the mansion had finally gone still. The music had stopped. The candles burned lower.